Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're going to get started in a few minutes as more trickle in. In the meantime, I'm going to start a poll. So if you all would like to fill that out as we wait, that'd be great. Welcome anyone who has just joined. We're going to get started in just a couple more minutes. But in the meantime, feel free to look at the results of our poll. You can see where we're all from. Pretty cool. All right, and in just our last minute or so as we wait, I'm going to open up another question for you all. We'd love to get your answer on that. All right, since it's 3:05 now, it seems like most people have joined. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming and welcome to National Students Against Exploitation training on trauma-informed approaches to human trafficking. This is our first part of the training series, and we are so glad you all could make it. We're going to go ahead and just start off by introducing the representatives. So I'll go ahead and start us off. My name is Naomi Pearl. I am one of the Southwest representatives for NSAE. I am a current undergrad student at UC Berkeley. If the rest of our panelists would mind turning on their cameras, and we'll continue introducing everyone.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Karsa. I am also a Southwest representative with Naomi, and I'm a current undergrad at San Diego State.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelly Sasser. I'm the Southern Regional Representative, and I'm an undergrad at Coastal Carolina University near Myrtle Beach.
My name is Sadie, and I am the representative for the Midwest region of NSAE, and I'm a current undergrad at Washington University in St. Louis.
Hi, my name is Camilla. I am the Northeast representative, and I'm currently an undergrad at Harvard.
And then Addie and Sabrina unfortunately couldn't make it today, but they are our Pacific Northwest representatives and are in law school at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, so just a quick introduction to us. We are National Students Against Exploitation, or NSAE, and our mission is to connect students from universities across the country to spread awareness for anti-human trafficking initiatives. We want to create this community of collegiate anti-trafficking advocates by offering professional and educational resources to students who are interested in work against exploitation. So basically, we're a collective of students that are doing anti-trafficking work, and we hope you guys will join us, and we'll give you some information on doing that later on in the presentation.
Before our guest speaker gets started, I'm just going to do a brief introduction for her. Our speaker is Dr. Grace Chang from San Diego State University. She is a poli-sci professor there, and she is also the director of the Interdisciplinary Human Rights Initiative, and she has an emphasis in human rights.
Thank you for that. Are we ready to start then?
We are good to go.
Okay, hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm impressed with the turnout here. So I'm very excited to be here and see so many of you interested in learning about human trafficking. I have a background in political science, so I have a specific approach. And so I'm going to talk about, some of the ways that governments and organizations define and handle human trafficking, and some of the experiences that those who have been trafficked go through, and look at those kinds of elements. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A, but I've given some detailed slides to also the organizers if you need to. And also my email is also available to you all. So I will get started. There's different elements today. I just wanted to kind of pause a little bit, and if you could write down just to yourself how you would define human trafficking, and as specific as possible, and anything you think about when you think about human trafficking. Okay, great. I'm glad to see we had some responses in the chat. Because of our limited time, we won't get into the discussion. I'll provide some answers, but yeah, the good posts here that we see. The migration, actually we'll address the question of whether it's legal or not, but it does involve movement, it does involve exploitation, and yeah, treating people in not very nice ways, which is inherent in the concept, right, of exploitation. So there is a definition, which is a legal definition. So as a political scientist, we're interested in how do we address the issue, and how adequately do we address it? And so it wasn't until 2000 that there was a kind of a really concerted effort on the international level. And that includes at the international level, the United Nations Forum with the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And supplementing that the same year in 2000 was this protocol, also known as Palermo Protocol, to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And that same year also the United States passed its Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So it was, the year 2000 was really the first year where there was this recognized as a certain phenomenon that, and gave it you know, a specific definition. And you know, that's always interesting to debate as well. But working with that, the general approach to trafficking is that it's not just a single act, and it doesn't always lead to a specific outcome, but it does refer to a process, right? Trafficking is something, you know, which sounds dynamic, active, right? And it does involve typically from the very beginning, the initial stage of recruitment of the persons, and then the movement of the person, the transportation. And then there's that element of control in order to exploit. And I actually did most of my study and work in Hawaii and in Southeast Asia before I moved to San Diego 4 years ago. So certainly there are, in every region of the world, we find this problem of trafficking because it, and I call it a problem because it is ending in a crime. Hence, it falls under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And you know, in crimes, people are hurt, right? Especially those who are subject to this. So for me, you know, having learned about trafficking in various contexts, it can be organized in numerous different ways, in different contexts, with different outcomes, but generally speaking, always ending up with the exploitation of the individuals who are trafficked. So it includes, you know, recruiters as well as the other people who are involved in the transport and in the coercion and in the, you know, in the exploitation of the labor, et cetera. So it's a, you know, that's probably one of the reasons why it took a while to come up with a definition that everyone could agree upon, because there are all of these kinds of distinct phenomenon, different contexts in different parts of the world, but you know, they all have in common the fact that there are vulnerable people who are moved and then, you know, subjected to terrible forms of exploitation. And that kind of exploitation includes prostitution, but it's not limited to prostitution. And so it's very interesting. I answered Pacific, right, West Coast, because I live here now for 4 years, but you know, I'm originally from New York City, and I lived most of my life in Hawaii, and I did a lot of my, you know, research in Southeast Asia. So, you know, when I was actually in Hawaii, this convention and protocol was adopted, and as well as the US Act to protect trafficking victims. And we had the big international conference was held there, and I was able to bring all my students. And there was a real emphasis on sex exploitation, but it is not the only way that the persons who are trafficked are exploited. So there are, you know, definitely, you know, significant problems with sex exploitation, but, you know, and that can include adults as well as children, but also in other forms of work, exploitation in domestic work, restaurants, agricultural work, factories and sweatshop. It can include debt bondage, and I'll talk a little bit about what it means, in forced begging, or, you know, being sold into marriage even. So there's a large range of different outcomes, right, in terms of the forms of exploitation. And so from a human rights perspective, there's many problems with this, because there are certain persons, right, certain groups of people who are more vulnerable. And so this is a violation of you know, this kind of targeting of certain persons. And so especially we'll see, women and children, but also the poor and also people from certain parts of the world as well. Obviously, the person's life is no longer their own life. They lack liberty, they lack security. They are subjected to forced labor, bonded labor, etc. They're mistreated. Many of those who are trafficked are female. And they're highly restrictive, so they don't have the ability to enjoy the freedoms that people in the United, like us anyway, are able to enjoy. And there are, definitely impacts negatively on their physical and mental health. And obviously, they're not treated well as workers in their work. And so these are all sorts of international laws that were kind of drawn to bring into the UN Convention from 2000 against transnational organized crime, and specifically the protocol against trafficking. So they were drawn from the CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as well as drawn from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Family. So the UN Convention Against Crime actually talks a lot about how to coordinate international efforts to address the issue. So it is not just a human rights document, but it includes all of that. So that is a good thing. But as we'll talk about further, there's still a lot of shortcomings in the way that the issue is addressed. So I'm going to focus more on the exploitation part, because we want to talk a bit about the experience and why the experience can be so traumatic. The U.S. has, as I said, a Trafficking Victims Protection Act and its own set of laws, which sort of parallel the UN Convention. And the U.S. law does recognize various forms of forced labor. They're all generally called forced labor, but technically a little bit of difference, right? Forced labor is when a person is placed in a condition where they're forced to work against their will through actual or implied threats of serious harm, physical restraint, or abuse. Involuntary servitude refers to if a person is forced to work through physical force or threats of physical force. Peonage refers to when someone is compelled by force, threat of force, or abuse of the law to work against their will in order to pay off a debt specifically. So, and then there's also debt bondage if the value of a person's work is never reasonably applied towards payment of the debt. So they can actually never get out of the debt. So there's some fine lines between all of them, but generally, when people speak about it, they wouldn't speak about forced labor. They could include any one of these specific types of forced labor. Okay, so here's a little summary. And as I said, I gave the organizers a copy of this, so in case you're interested. And this is a fairly, significant phenomenon. The way that it's very hard, because it is a crime, it is not above ground, right? It's not, people don't generally commit criminal acts in broad daylight for the public to see, because there's consequences. So it's very difficult to know the extent. So the International Labor Organization has concluded or estimated that there are 2.4 million who are in positions where they are compelled to forced labor as a result of trafficking. So there are persons who are subjected to forced labor. ILO estimates over 12 million of them at any given time, but not all of them necessarily as a result of trafficking. So that is an estimate. the United States State Department, looking at trafficking, are concerned with people being trafficked into the United States. So as one of you guys pointed out in the chat, right, being transported into another country in an illegal manner. So this number doesn't include, persons who are trafficked within the United States. Okay, so that could be US citizens or permanent residents, et cetera. And so that number is not included in there. And the Berkeley Human Rights Center estimates at least 10,000 people at any time working at forced labor. So the numbers are hard to conclude, but certainly in the United States, people believe that the numbers are probably in the hundreds of thousands in actuality. So since this is not a above ground formal economic sector, they are difficult to find. So as I was saying, just focusing on the United States, because like there's many different contexts around the world. So in order to just remain focused, we'll talk about what we have, the situation in the US. And as I said, the State Department's concern is really about foreigners who are trafficked and exploited within the United States, not so much paying attention to domestic issues of trafficking. And that is something that I'll touch upon a little bit later. So the worldwide and in the United States as well, it's estimated that the significant proportion are women and children. And so I don't know if you guys have an idea of why that is, if you have any thoughts. Why is that women and children make up possibly, likely 80% of trafficking victims? So, this goes back to the issue of discrimination. Women and children generally are, don't enjoy the same status in many societies, and including in the United States. This is a patriarchal legacy of patriarchy, some residual, right, sexism or outright sexism. And they often suffer more. They're overrepresented as far as those who suffer poverty, discrimination, and in certain parts of the world, illiteracy and lower levels of education. Also elsewhere where there are open conflicts, many of the conflicts, they're not like armed conflicts, they're not like traditional wars, like with militaries against each other. They fight in the situation where they're mixing in the civilian population, and women and children get, they become very vulnerable because of that. So there are also, many different problems with economic opportunities for women and for poor families, which may make children vulnerable. Just gonna see if you have anything, right? Yeah, being financially dependent, right? If you have less access to your own income, or if the households don't have kind of equal share of decision-making power among males and females, and certainly children, right, are definitely not, in the position of authority sometime, and dependent on their parents. So, yeah, so this is probably also why some people, when they think of human trafficking, they often think of sex trafficking, because a large number or percentage are women and females. Now, talking about, what the experiences tend to be also across the world where people have been studying. And at the, you know, it was interesting at the 2000, that was 21 years ago. Some of you might have just been born. That international conference, it was so interesting because there were people from all over the world who were there. And so you could see, even though the contexts were different, there were, you know, the reasons why people left, the situations they left, what the outcomes were, their experiences were very similar. The organizations working with those who were being trafficked. So typically the experience of abuse, because, you know, for a variety of reasons, right? But especially if they are being trafficked across state lines, across the borders of different countries illegally, right? They are in fear because they're not there illegally. You know, their exploiters can exploit that. And they're also in very unfamiliar surroundings. So they experience physical, psychological abuse that can, you know, that can be physical in the sense of actual beatings, that can be sexual abuse, that can be deprivation of food, deprivation of treatment, and so forth. Threats that they face, obviously the threat of abuse, and other kinds of withdrawal of just some basic, you know, enjoyments that they might have. But some, you know, as we saw, at least with, especially when international trafficking, that the recruiters would go to villages. And so the recruiters typically knew where you were coming from. So they would say, well, we know where your family are. We know that they need you. And that's why, you know, you all agreed that you should come with us for the work that we are providing you. And so if you don't do what we say, you know, your family will pay the consequences. So this is one way family members might be threatened. And because, you know, especially if they are in situations where they've crossed borders without the formal paperwork, you know, they're afraid because of their immigration status, they're afraid to leave the house, they're unfamiliar, and they're afraid, you know, they will be caught and suffer from, you know, immigration in so that sense. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more because that is very, very important. And so talking about, you know, how people become trafficked, there's usually, like I said, in the beginning, there is the recruitment of the persons. And at least, you know, and as I said, it is very different from place to place. There are, you know, situations where people are very, very desperate and they know the likelihood of what's going to happen to them. I know from some refugee camps in Southeast Asia where the situation is very dire, you know, they rather be trafficked out than remain there. It's terrible situations. In other situations, what we're looking at is often, you know, people are told by a recruiter that, oh, if you come with us to Japan or to the United States or wherever it is, you'll have a nice job. You'll work in a restaurant. You'll work in a hotel. You'll work in something that is, you know, respectable and normal. So they'll make false promises, luring their victims into these future jobs, which is really a condition of forced labor. Yeah, there's lots of ways they might do it. So it could be through deception. Sometimes it is coercion or physical force. And obviously, if there is no really good option, people are not making you know, an informed or offering real consent to go. So there's a range of different reasons how people are lured or coerced into the situation. So often the victims are not able to really consent to their situation once they are in the place where they will be exploited, where they will be forced to perform the forced labor. This will involve physical force, psychological force, as we were talking about, but also legal and economic coercion, as we were talking about, the legal as far as exploiting their illegal status. There might be in some countries, we've seen the police not really caring, and being corrupt and actually enabling some of the trafficking. So there's a lot of different elements that go against the ability of those who are trafficked, who find they were deceived, to get out of that situation. So coming specifically back to the United States in that sort of situation, we in those who have done studies of forced labor associated with trafficking, those who have found themselves in that situation are often doing domestic work. They're working in households. Agriculture is another big one. Sweatshops, factory work, restaurants, hotels, and the sex industry. There's kind of a tendency to assume that, the cities have more of them. And so there have been higher numbers reported in cities or in parts of the country where there's a lot higher levels of immigration as well. So New York City itself, but California and Florida, because of agriculture, right, in those states, as well as big cities, in California and Florida. Las Vegas has high numbers, but we've seen all states report cases. In Hawaii, it's a very similar situation to Florida, I guess. In California, there's a lot of agriculture, but there's also urban sector. So there's like sweatshops and the restaurant and other industries beyond that as well. So there's a great diversity of different sectors that they get exploited into. So there is, there's a demand for labor. We found in Hawaii, out in the west coast of Oahu, these individuals who were living in containers in the middle of like this really hot area. They were doing agricultural work. There are other situations like that too, but generally, right, the demand for cheap labor, for the ability of entrepreneurs to operate, and take advantage of these kinds of networks. That is one of that is the main reason for the pull, right? Why that will, why so many different countries, all 50 states in the United States, are host to victims of trafficking. And that said, there's many push factors too that might contribute to someone's vulnerability to believing, and sometimes they're deceived, right? Many times they're deceived to believing that this is something good out there. And certainly, when you don't know, right, the person recruiting you, you might be a little bit skeptical. But if you are especially, in a bad situation, you might like, well, what do I have to lose? If you come from a situation where there's poverty, an abusive domestic situation, if there's just no jobs or opportunities, the standard of living is very poor, there might be like no plumbing, no indoor toilet facilities, for example, in some parts. lots of crime, organized crime that we're seeing a lot of people coming to the southern border of the United States, for example, fleeing especially situations of crime, and the political situations as well, the instability, political violence, and so forth. And as we said, discrimination against women and girls. So it's in the United States, it's something we can do, we can do something about. And it's because a lot of people who are trafficked in the United States, they are in sectors of work where the law doesn't recognize or protect workers. So for example, domestic workers, people who work in households, right, doing domestic, taking care of kids, cleaning, doing, the whatever you need to do around the property. That's usually very informal, right? So very often they are excluded from some of the stuff that workers in other sectors have protections for. That is, they're covered under anti-discrimination laws, like our labor relations laws. They're covered about, like if you work overtime, right? You should get overtime pay. You get their health and safety regulation, OSHA, right? And oversees the conditions of your work. You have the right to organize or to collectively, speak out about your work conditions. Domestic workers don't have that. And certainly in the sex work industry, that doesn't exist because in many places that's illegal. So in these areas, we don't recognize them as workers as you do in other sectors. So they're totally, vulnerable because of the lack of legal protections. Our migrant worker programs, many migrant workers come to work in the agricultural sector in the United States legally, but the laws are very, very, make them vulnerable because their immigration status is tied to their employment with a single employer. And, that employer then has a lot, right, of leverage over them. And so the conditions of work might be so terrible. And some of, many of them who can't stand it will leave. And then once they leave that employment, they're automatically illegal. And so they might become vulnerable, to being exploited in other areas. And certainly with undocumented immigrants, because the law doesn't cover them. So these are areas that can be addressed by, if we look at the laws and where they create gaps for exploitation, for vulnerability of the persons to being trafficked into conditions of exploitation. So we do, as I talked about earlier, in the year 2000, this is the Trafficking Victims or Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of the year 2000. So the Department of HHS, anyone? What's that? Health and Human Services. So first, this is intended to protect people who are bona fide victims of trafficking. And so the Health and Human Services must certify that an individual is indeed a victim of trafficking. And that itself, right, comes up with a lot of complications you can imagine. And once you are determined by HHS, you are certified as somebody who would be protected under this act, then you will be eligible for all of the services and benefits that refugees receive in the United States. But, besides that, right, besides being certified by the HHS, you have to, especially if you are moving across borders, right, national borders, you have to have some sense of what your legal immigration status is. And that is another big difficulty. So there's various forms of addressing immigration status or getting legal immigration status. And one is the continued presence status to lawfully remain in the United States, that can only be requested by a law enforcement agent. And it's conditioned on the victim's cooperation with law enforcement in a criminal investigation. And it's issued for 1 year increments, 1 year at a time. The other option is a T visa, which persons who've been trafficked can petition for themselves if they agree to cooperate with law enforcement in a criminal investigation. So in that case, they need to cooperate with any requests for assistance in the investigation of the prosecution of any acts of trafficking. And then U visas are another option. They're also issued if you have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of being a victim of certain crimes designated by the Trafficking Victims and Violence Protection Act. So again, in order to be eligible, you have to have cooperated or be willing to cooperate in a criminal investigation. So all three of these, they're slightly different, but all three of them require that the individual cooperate in a criminal investigation against those involved in the trafficking ring. You think that's a problem? Or that's not a big deal? Again, it can be a problem because if they know where your family is, for example, and also if you're new to a place, if you're not familiar, you don't speak the language well, you're not familiar with the agencies and so forth, you're very vulnerable if you do remain here. So many people are very nervous about that, about having to participate in the prosecution. So that's one area where people are all saying, well, you don't have to make that the condition for victims of trafficking to remain. And also there's a limited number of visas that are distributed annually. And so it is potentially, not available to, even if many people are willing to do so. And of course, if a person is fleeing from a situation that's covered under asylum law, then, they can apply for asylum, refugee status, political asylum. So that is different conditions. That is if you can demonstrate that you have a fear of persecution or threats when you return to your home country. And so if you do receive, approval for any of these statuses, you do have the right to work, to get authorization for employment and all of the benefits and services that, are available to residents. And you can eventually adjust your residency status, including for permanent residency. Okay, so, again, there's been a lot of criticism about the requirement for participating in criminal prosecutions. And also, when people escape their situation, sometimes the number one thing in those who are in the authorities' mind is are you legal? And so in one study found that nearly 70% of those who escaped exploitation were arrested or placed in detention centers and then deported. So this status, right, of their immigration status seems to be prioritized versus, addressing their human rights, right, the experiences that they went through that had made them actually victims of trafficking. So, if they, and the various studies have shown it's very difficult, right, for them to recover any sort of damages. Obviously, it's difficult in any kind of legal case. And, it's very challenging because of the psychological trauma experienced by many of such persons. And also, not knowing the environment, not knowing the options, not knowing what kinds of support there are. Many of them find it very challenging to leave the industries into which they've been trafficked, so remain in those. So that is a continued problem. So great to have, Free to Thrive, for example, as an organization to help. So also the Urban Institute, and again, our numbers, we don't have definitive numbers, but these are pretty good studies with regard to the methodology that they collect their data. Actually many people have entered legally. There's a multiplicity of reasons why they might be subjected to trafficking, especially in this case, sex trafficking, sex exploitation. And many people also, you might be in contact with, right? In restaurants, in hotels, in industries, they're actually, working and interfacing with the public while they are enduring these kinds of abuses by their exploiters. So there are things that can be done if we understand how this phenomenon takes place and what the experience is, what the human rights issues are here. So yeah, as I was saying, there is a trafficking act, or an act to help with domestic trafficking, and especially this is very focused on child trafficking. So this is undertaken by the FBI and so forth, if you're interested. And then many different recommendations. I have like a minute, so here's the list. And I don't know if we do questions and answers, but I have the slides for your organizers, as I said. So I will just end it there because of our time.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Chang, for your wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and switch over just to the last part, the NSAE slides.
Okay, and I have a class to go to, so I will leave you all, and my information is available. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. All right, please bear with me while I bring up our slides again in just a sec. And we'll continue now with the rest of our training.
So the next video we're going to show you guys is from what we call our Thriver Spotlight. And this is actually from Free to Thrive. So I think we haven't explained this yet, but Free to Thrive is a legal clinic in San Diego, based in San Diego, and is actually our parent organization. It's kind of how all of us met to begin with. But Free to Thrive's mission and, its values is to really empower survivors to thrive outside of exploitation and be able to live, a full life outside of their exploitation. And the way that they do this is there's two ways, mostly, and the main goal is to help survivors with their legal services, whether that be with family law matters, something called vacatur, or even criminal law proceedings. And also by providing holistic support services, whether that be housing or education or finding employment and things like that. So by covering both legal needs and also any support services, Free to Thrive helps survivors truly feel empowered and thrive later in their lives. And so the video we're going to show is actually a survivor that Free to Thrive helped, Willanisha, and she is a true example of an empowered woman that is now a lived experience expert and someone that Free to Thrive was able to help through our services. So we're going to just show that video very quickly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Willanisha, also known as Truth, and I'm an artivist. So pretty much I use my vocal abilities and my voice to speak for those that don't have a voice. When I first connected with Free to Thrive, I was not identifying as a human trafficking victim. I was like, no, I chose to live this life. But a few friends had told me about the program, and I just was not ready to do the process. My experience going to court in Orange County for my vacatur hearing was very restorative. When we went in the courtroom, we had just got there from San Diego, and the judge was like, I want to see Wilnisha. I was like, oh my God, like, can I breathe? Like, I just got here. I went to the podium, and my pro bono lawyer had talked to the judge, and the judge was like, I read over your case. Keep in mind, like, it was a courtroom full of people, and I thought that this judge was gonna like out me and tell my story, but he didn't. I read your story, and I'm really proud of you. You're the way you changed your life, and who did that work, and who made all this happen. You did, and it's just amazing to see you stand in my courtroom today. I would love to come off my bench and shake your hand. And I was like, wait, what? Did I hear that correctly? He was like, is that okay? Like, he asked for consent too. I was like, sure, come on down. So he came down and shook my hand, and like a firm handshake, and the whole courtroom just started clapping. And I was still in shock. Like, I can't believe this is happening right now. And so me and Jamie walked out of the courtroom, and Jamie was like, that was amazing, Wilnisha. This has never happened before. And I was like, it is amazing. And it was like total healing. Hello, everyone. My name is Wilnisha, also known as.
And if you guys are interested in seeing more Thriver Spotlight videos, they're actually available on the Free to Thrive website, which we're gonna link below in the chat. The NSAE website, it's the same website, it's just like a subsection. So if you guys are interested in seeing more Thriver Spotlights, there's different stories, obviously, because everybody is different and everybody's experience is different. I would really encourage you to check those out. But that marks the end of our presentation and this first part of the training. Thank you guys so much for coming. In terms of the certification and the participation certificate, if you attend part 2, which is going to be on Wednesday, April 14th at the same time, so 3 p.m. Pacific, and you can join using the same link, you will receive the participation certificate for completing the training. So it's the same link. You can mark that on your calendars. Same time, Wednesday, April 14th.
So Jasmine just dropped the link in the chat. This is a way to get involved with Free to Thrive. We are a growing organization, a collective of students all across the country that are interested in providing support for survivors of human trafficking and advocating for anti-human trafficking legislation and advocacy. So this is our social media. If you're interested in connecting with us on there, and if you follow the link that Jasmine sent in the chat, that can help you sign up to be a part of our organization, and we'll keep you updated on further meetings and stuff. So that is all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for coming. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We hope to see you next week.
Hey, Naomi, do you want us to stick around?
Sure, we can have, if you have to go, no worries, but we can chat for just a couple minutes.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for coming, everyone.